can I have a home, a property that I have a mortgage on, put into a revocable trust? And does that answer stay the same with irrevocable trusts?
I'm so glad you asked that, because the answer is it is different in these scenarios.
All right, Jim, you are back in the den here. It's been a while, so we've got a new configuration for you.
This is beautiful. I walked in and I was like, the new setup and looks fantastic. So well done.
You just live further away, so we don't get you here as often as this happens. But no, I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you. It's beautiful.
We have a question. Well, I have questions for you, and it's mostly around the nature of the trusts. And so we've talked in the past, you offer help and assistance with revocable trusts.
Correct.
And then the question comes up, well, what are irrevocable trusts? Mm-hmm. So maybe you can take us through, and I don't know the best way to organize this. You can kind of go through this, but what are the advantages of a revocable trust versus an irrevocable trust? And maybe we can get into the nitty gritty, and I'll have questions as you get into this.
Perfect. I think probably the best thing to do starting off is just define them. I get that question a lot where people are like, what does revocable mean? What is irrevocable? So revocable it can be revoked. It can be terminated or changed. And that's a really important thing for a lot of people because we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly what the future holds. And right now our kids may be angels and everything's perfect, but years down the road, that may look very different. And if you have a revocable trust, you can make those changes. Revocable, just remember that means you can revoke it or change it. When we talk about irrevocable, that's the exact opposite. It is unchangeable. So when you set up an irrevocable trust, you have to be really, really sure this is exactly how I want things to be set up, because once you set that baby up, it's set in stone with doing that. So that by definition is revocable versus irrevocable. One question that a lot of people ask is they go, well, what's the benefit of, why would anybody ever want to set up a trust that they can't change? Like, that makes no sense. Why would somebody do that to themselves, set up this irrevocable trust that they can never make changes to down the road? Why would you do that? And the answer is liability protection or asset protection. So, and then people go, well, don't all trusts provide liability protection? And the answer is no. And that's a big misconception, because a lot of people think, we talk to people day in and day out that are like, oh yeah, all trusts provide liability protection. The answer is they actually don't. And the type of trust that doesn't is a revocable. And people go, well, why is that? Why doesn't a revocable trust provide any type of liability protection? And the answer is A, because it's changeable. You make changes whenever you want. But more importantly, when you set up a revocable trust, you still own and control your assets that are in the trust. So for liability purposes, if you have this revocable trust and you've transferred your assets into that trust, well, you still own and control that trust. So if there is ever a debtor, creditor, lost it or something, they're still able to attach to those assets.
That makes sense. And on our end, like dealing with Medicare, and a lot of times Medicaid will come in. I'm not a Medicaid expert, but that comes in a lot of this asset protection on Medicaid. So it sounds like a revocable trust is not going to provide that kind of protection.
Correct.
And if you're trying to deal with Medicaid, that's going over into the irrevocable.
Irrevocable.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a huge question and a huge concern for a lot of people. Is now, just to describe for those that aren't really totally aware of Medicaid and what that really means. So essentially, Medicaid is a program that the government has for low-income people that aren't able to pay for long-term care. And so what a lot of people do is they go, well, I've worked my entire life and I've saved, I've got my home and I've got some money in the bank. And if I ever need to go into, a long-term care facility, that's going to be gone really quickly because it's expensive. And it's true. It absolutely is. And so people will ask and they'll say, I want to set up a trust so that if I ever need to go into, some type of long-term care facility, then my assets will be protected. Well, again, if you have a revocable trust, they are not protected. So if you ever needed to go into any type of nursing home or long-term care assisted living, you'd still have the assets that are in your trust. You still have to indicate that those are yours, and they would force you to spend those down. And then once you've spent all of your money, then Medicaid will kick in and they'll pay for care. And again, we don't do those types of trusts. Those are irrevocable. So there are ways that you can set things up as long as you give yourself enough time.
Right.
Most states have like a 5-year look back. Sometimes they call it a clawback. That just means that they're able to look back into your financial history 5 years to see what you've done with your assets. Because we do get a lot of people that they'll call and they're like, my spouse passed away, or a lot of times it's the kids that give us a call, quite frankly, and they'll say, mom passed away or dad passed away, and our surviving parent isn't doing well. They may need to go into some type of a long-term care facility, and is the trust going to protect the assets? And the answer is, with a revocable trust, no. Now, if they have an irrevocable trust, they call them irrevocable Medicaid. There's a few different ways of saying that, but a lot of them are irrevocable Medicaid trusts. And if you have time on your side, you can set those types of trusts up at least 5 years in advance, meaning mom and dad are healthy, they're doing well, the assets have been put into that irrevocable Medicaid trust. And then if it gets past that 5-year period and mom or dad need to go into a care facility, then those assets can be protected from that Medicaid spend down because they followed the rules of doing that. We get calls all the time where, again, it's typically one spouse has passed away or one parent has passed away, and the other one's like, they're going to need to go into a care facility next month. We need to set up, an irrevocable Medicaid trust. And I'm like, it's too late. Yeah. You can't do it at that point in time. And so I know that can be frustrating. But again, I guess we'll talk a little bit about some of the downsides of irrevocable trusts as well. Because a lot of people, when we talk about that, they're like, that sounds like all upside. We're able to essentially shelter our assets and we get, protection from debtors and creditors. And what's the downside? Well, the downside is, again, it's irrevocable. It's unchangeable. The other thing with irrevocable trusts is you have to give up control of your assets. So if like, let's say my wife and I wanted to set up an irrevocable trust, well, we can't control the trust. We can't be the trustees of our own trust. And so we then have to appoint somebody that we have 100% complete confidence in to carry out our wishes, or you have to hire somebody to do that. And again, there are a lot of law firms that will do that. But
and that gets down to like the actual distribution of the stuff in the trust, right? Like I can't pull assets from my irrevocable trust when I want it. It's up to that individual. Right.
With doing that. And that's a downside. That's a big draw, because a lot of people, they're like, I want to be able to control my money. And if I ever want to buy, sell, deposit, withdraw, I want to be able to have control over that. I don't want to have to go to somebody else to do that. And again, I agree. That's one of the downsides of having those irrevocable trusts is they're very binding. Some of the other issues is taxes. So when you have these irrevocable trusts, typically they have to apply for a separate EIN, like a tax ID number. So they file a separate tax return, and then you have to have an accountant or a CPA that knows what they're doing to make sure your income taxes are getting filed the proper way. And all these things just gets very complex and it gets very expensive. And that is another thing that is a downside of irrevocable trusts, is they are more expensive. For a lot of people, when they start thinking about going, well, I do love the idea of asset protection, but I don't love the idea of it being more expensive, giving up control of everything. It's completely permanent. My taxes are going to change. Mm-hmm. Those are a lot of things that deter people from doing that. And if you happen to fit into that category of, I really want to do an irrevocable trust, and what you're saying is ringing, and speaking to my heart here, then it would be a good idea to sit down with a local estate planning attorney that has been. I typically encourage people. I'm like, if you're going to be doing an irrevocable trust, make sure that you sit down with an estate planning attorney, and sometimes even like a tax planning attorney that has at least a minimum of 10 years of experience in irrevocable trusts, because they are a completely different animal than a revocable trust.
When you talk about the costs of all of this and that asset protection, it seems like you need a certain level of assets for this. And just before this, as I was watching and reading some stuff, it seems like that estate tax or that death tax that comes into play is maybe an opportunity here. If you do have ultra levels of wealth, a revocable trust isn't really going to shelter any of that from that estate tax, whereas an irrevocable trust could come in and...
Interestingly enough, there is a way. So, and I don't think I mentioned this earlier. We were talking about, there was actually one of your followers that had a question that said, wait a second. So we have a revocable trust. Well, what happens when I die? Does the trust remain revocable? And the answer is no. So when you set up a revocable trust, when you pass away, then it automatically turns irrevocable. And then you can have different rules set up for your children or your beneficiaries on when, where, and how you want that money to get to them. And that money can be protected.
Okay.
Because the trust goes irrevocable, and again, it has a lot of those protections. So when that way, like if my wife and I passed away and the money's going on to our children, we can set up some rules within that trust, and that the trust is irrevocable at that point in time, and it protects from debtors and creditors and future spouses if something goes sideways there with that. So that's one good thing. And going back to what you said, so the federal estate tax is, you actually can write a revocable trust so that if, one or both spouses pass away and they are over that federal estate tax exemption, the trust can actually split. They call them A-B trusts. So that way the A trust gets the full exemption, the B trust gets the full exemption. So really, in essence, you're doubling the federal estate tax exemption. And you can do that utilizing a revocable trust that essentially converts into subsidiary irrevocable trusts as well.
Interesting. So does that mean that it's kind of like a sub-trust structure that you can make either with that or even with my kids? So if my spouse and I both pass away, then it's a irrevocable trust that goes to kid 1, kid 2, kid 3 to protect them from, again, their spouse or anything else that wants to come after them.
Exactly. Okay. But the key that you have to understand is while you and your wife are alive, it's revocable. Mm-hmm. And then when you both pass away, then it goes irrevocable to have those benefits with doing that.
And in past videos, we've talked about that flexibility of the revocable trust of if a child passes away before I do or before we do, or if a child, again, goes off the rails and something is happening and we don't really want all of the funds going there. What does that look like on an irrevocable trust side? Are kids named beneficiaries in that?
Great question. And the answer is yes. So there's really a lot of different types of irrevocable trusts. It's not just like revocable, irrevocable. There's lots of different types of irrevocable trusts. And the majority of those irrevocable trusts are set up to give asset protection to, again, a husband and wife or an individual while they're alive. So they essentially are the beneficiaries, of that. But then when they pass away, very similar to a revocable trust, you set forth those same rules in an irrevocable trust that say, hey, when we pass away, now our children are the beneficiaries, and this is how we want the money getting to them. And again, it has those some of those same protections in there as well. But that's why it's important when you're doing those irrevocable trusts to have an attorney that has been doing that for 10 years, and they focus on that, and they're really, really good, and they know all the ins and outs. And a lot of these irrevocable trusts are also very state specific because every state has different rules. And I think that's one of the big things to keep in mind as well is not all states are equal when it comes to irrevocable trusts, especially these asset protection trusts. And I think right now there's probably just under 20 states that recognize these asset protection trusts. But you think about that going, that's 30 or 31, 32 states that don't recognize those asset protection trusts. And everything's driven right by statute. So those states that do recognize these asset protection trusts, it's written right into their codes and statutes. If you have an irrevocable trust, it provides these very specific benefits. And some states don't have that. And so that makes it a little bit trickier as well, because if you're going to be setting up an irrevocable trust and you're like, I don't live in one of those states, well, now you got to hire somebody that does live in that state, because remember, you can't be the trustee of your own trust. You have to have somebody else that does that. And most of these states require the trustee live in the state where that trust is established. So anyhow, it's kind of interesting. And there's a lot of these, interesting rules that revolve around that. And again, they're complex. They're very complicated. And that's why, again, they are expensive. And, there's a reason why they are set up the way that they are, and you need to have somebody that knows exactly what they're doing with doing that.
So maybe high level, we can just recap this of who fits really well for a revocable trust, like that person or that family, and then who fits really well for an irrevocable trust.
Yeah, great question on that one. Truthfully, the majority of people, the revocable trust is the very, very best option, because
that transforms into an irrevocable
trust.
Right,
okay, well said. That transfers in or transforms into an irrevocable trust when you pass away. That is probably, somebody asked me and they said, percentage-wise, how many people have revocable versus irrevocable? I don't know what the percentages are on that, but I would dare say probably 90 to 95% of the trusts that are out there are revocable. So the majority of people are doing revocable trusts because, again, they do so many great things with being able to control when, where, and how you want your assets to go and who's going to be in control of carrying out your wishes and keeping everything private. And then when you pass away and it does turn irrevocable, there's some protections for the kids. And so for the majority of people, that's the revocable trust is really going to be the best tool.
You just said on something that is kind of ringing, because I'm making a video that hasn't been released yet, but it will be coming out, of the dangers that a lot of spouses face when their spouse passes away. So I've been doing a lot of this random research on that topic.
Yeah.
And one of them is that there are actual predators, criminals that will search through the probate courts and they will find widows and widowers, and then they will prey on them for these things. So what you said was a trust is private.
Private.
Yeah. And so maybe you can just real quickly touch on that versus a will that isn't.
A lot of people don't know exactly what you just said. So usually when one spouse dies, if they just have a will, that will is going to go through the probate courts. And that will has to be recorded as part of that process. So then anybody that knows what they're doing can log on to the public record and read that will and what you have and where it's going. And that, for a lot of people, they're like, wait, what? That's public knowledge? And the answer is yes, it actually is. And then you get people exactly like what you said, that they can prey on those widows or widowers that aren't really aware of that and be like, oh, well, your spouse owed me. I did work for them a long time ago and they owed me X amount. And anyhow, and it just can really bog things down and create issues, and people can get taken advantage that way. So where you have a trust is a private agreement. It's never recorded anywhere. It's not filed with the state or your county. And when you pass away, it's also not recorded as well. So it keeps everything private, which is a huge thing. A lot of people love that aspect about a trust. And whether it's revocable or irrevocable, they're both private.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's great. Again, that just kind of triggered something in my mind when you mentioned that. And then, so we've kind of gone over who works well with the revocable trust side, and it's the majority of people. And then again, who would you recommend really seek out the irrevocable trust side of things?
Usually those are your high net worth earners. And that could be, a doctor or surgeon that's making a lot of money and they have a little bit higher risk because of what they do by nature of just being a doctor and the potential of getting sued. Now, obviously they have, their malpractice insurance and things like that, but a lot of them want to set these irrevocable trusts up to kind of go above and beyond that. So high net worth earners are a good candidate for these irrevocable trusts. And a lot of people go, what does that mean? Like high net worth, what does that mean? Well, on the federal estate tax side of things, currently right now, it's just under $14 million. And most people are like, okay, we're nowhere near $14 million. And so, and not that has to be like the threshold of like, oh, $14. But, when you start to get into that irrevocable trust world, most people in maybe the 7, 8, 9, 10 million, and certainly as your 10 million plus, that probably makes sense to start getting some of those asset protection trusts in place, and you've got the money to do it. So yes, it's going to be more expensive, and yes, your accounting bill is going to go up because the way that your accounting is going to be done is going to be different, but it's worth it, and it's worth paying that higher dollar amount because you've got more to protect. But the majority of people are not in that category. I mean, if that percentage of people that are in that 10 million plus, I would dare say are in a very, very, at least here in the United States, that's probably what the top 3 to 5% of the population even fit into that category of doing that. So by and large, the revocable trust is what most people should be looking for, but those high earners can.
Well, it's interesting because it seems like it's almost the extremes there too, because we have the high net worth individuals, but then going back to those Medicaid trusts, that's like the exact opposite, right? So it's those who, they may not be super high net worth, but the worth that they do have, they don't want to have to spend that all the way down.
Correct.
And
that's a tricky one right there. And I hadn't really thought of exactly like that of, a lot of the irrevocable trusts are for high net worth earners, but these irrevocable Medicaid trusts, those are for people that are typically a little, and I don't want to say lower, they don't have high income, because there are a lot of people that still, they've done very well for themselves. They may not be 10 million plus, but they've done very well for themselves. And they're like, if I go into a healthcare facility or long-term care, I want to lose everything.
It's almost like their income isn't keeping pace with what their expenses would be at this point in their lives, right?
Right.
Typically older, or they've got some sort of a disability that's happening.
Right. And a lot of people ask that, and they go, well, when should we start looking at those irrevocable, those irrevocable Medicaid trusts? And people are like, should I start doing that like in my 30s or 40s or 50s? And typically the answer would be no, because the likelihood of you needed to go into some type of long-term care facility is probably pretty slim. So for most people, it's when they retire. So when they retire, all of a sudden this is going to sound really bad the way that I say this, but sometimes when people stop working, they sometimes feel like they lose a little bit of their purpose. And so their life slows down a little bit and they're not as engaged as they are. And sometimes the health starts to fail because of that. I know that was how it was from my own dad. He worked for 52 years and we kept trying to get him to retire, but he loved to work and it gave him purpose. And as soon as he retired, man, his health went really downhill quickly. And so that's typically a good time where people should start to kind of think about, like, do we need to do one of the, some type of an irrevocable Medicaid trust, and start thinking about that because of that 5-year look back. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure that you're planning well ahead of time so that you don't find yourself in a pickle of like, well, now I need a healthcare facility and I don't have 5 years to stay and remain healthy with doing that.
What is the 5 year? What are they looking back 5 years for? Is that your income from 5 years, or what is it?
Really and truly, it is everything. They're looking at real estate, your bank accounts, life insurance, annuities, if you have a pension, Social Security. They were looking at everything when you apply for Medicaid, because what they're looking for is they want to see, like, okay, if we don't pay for your care, how long can you care for yourself? And are you able to care for yourself? And so they're kind of calculating all of those things, going, well, you're receiving Social Security, you've got a pension, and then they go, but if you need to go into a care facility, they might go, well, between my Social Security and my pension, I'm receiving $4,000 to $5,000 a month. But if I go into care facility, that's between $8,000 and $12,000 a month. So that's going to eat into that savings very quickly. Kind of an interesting concept with how that all plays out.
This is probably the most frequent comment that I see, because you're a TikTok star at this point through this channel.
That's funny.
It's probably like the best world for you, because I don't think you're really on TikTok, but through this channel, it's in the millions of views off of your TikTok videos. So thank you for that. But the most common question we get there and here on YouTube is, how much does it cost? How much does a trust cost? Yeah. Because they think of it as this huge expense. And now we're talking about two different types of things here. So there's the revocable, irrevocable. So what can people generally expect from a cost perspective on these two? Like, it's going to depend on where you are, and I get all that, but
absolutely. So, and I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about, like, if you were to go into an estate planning law firm, what it would cost for a revocable trust and an irrevocable trust. I'm going to talk about what our fee is for a revocable trust as well. So if the average cost, like if you went into any type of an estate planning law firm to get a trust done, the national average right now is really between, probably on the very low end of things, $1,500. On the high end of things, probably $5,000. $4,000 is kind of what I hear over and over as I'm talking to people that are like, hey, I went and met with an attorney. They quoted me $4,000 to get a revocable trust done. And they're like, that feels like a lot of money. And that's why I'm talking to you, because we want to get this done, but we want to get it done, at a more cost-effective price. Now, as you get closer to the coastlines, it does get more expensive with doing that. So again, if you happen to live on the coastline, I'm sorry about that, because it's more expensive, but also you live on the coastline. So it's beautiful, hopefully, where you live. But it is more expensive with doing that. So on the revocable side of things, somewhere between $1,500 and $5,000, that's kind of where the door would be open.
And does that go up as you get more complex too? So
it can, yes. Yeah, it can.
The more properties you have, the more things that are...
Absolutely, with that. Typically on the irrevocable side of things, you're going to be starting on the very, very minimum side of things, about $3,000, and then those can go up to $10,000 plus very quickly. And again, a lot of the attorneys justify their price because they go, well, we're going to set up one of these irrevocable Medicaid trusts for you. And if you have to go into a care facility because you don't have this trust, it's going to be somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 first month. Yeah. So that's the way they kind of justify their prices, is they say, you know what, I'm going to charge you 10 grand or 15,000, but that's only essentially 1.5 months or so of you going into a care facility without having any of this done. So it can get really expensive with that. But so that hopefully gives you a little bit of an idea of somewhere between 1,500 and 5,000 on the revocable side, somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 plus on the irrevocable side of things. So on our cost, we do everything in straight flat fees. Truthfully, that was one of the main reasons why I started this business, 20 years ago, is I wanted it to be affordable for everybody, regardless of where you live. I didn't want it to be like, oh, well, because you live in California, the price is going to be way more expensive, or because you live on the East Coast or whatever. So we just have straight flat fees across the board for those. So our revocable trust package is $695, and there is a $15 shipping. So I usually tell people it's $710. And then depending on properties, or how many properties you have, or if you want them transferred into the trust. A lot of people that we're talking to, they either are mortgaging their home or they own their home outright. And so they want our help getting that deed prepared to get the title transferred over into the trust. And so we charge $250 to do that. So for most people, if you have one home, like your primary residence, it's going to be the $710 for the full trust package, and then the $250 for the deed preparation. So it's $960. So for less than $1,000, you're getting your full estate plan done. And that includes all of your powers of attorney and healthcare directives and living wills, and all those are included as well.
Well, and this is why I'm so happy that I found you. And over the last year and a half or so that we've been doing this and getting to know each other, and like the people that you've helped, it's just been all positive. So thank you so much. And then you helped us, my wife and I, with ours.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. We'll have to show a picture or something, because the package that this comes in is the most organized estate plan in the world. And so it's fantastic.
I'm glad you just said that. And I'm almost kicking myself because really, my wife, she said, you ought to take, what the end product looks like so that they can see that. And I was like, oh, they won't want to see that. And so when you said that, she's literally, when she watches this back, she's going to go, I told you so. Honestly, probably a really, really high compliment that we love to hear is we get a lot of people that will call back and they'll say, hey, I went in to meet with my notary, whether it was at the bank or wherever, and they said that this was the most organized estate planning binder or trust binder that they've ever seen. And that always makes us feel good. And we have the sign here sticky tab. So that way everybody knows exactly where to sign with doing that as well. So we try to make it as easy as we possibly can and keep the cost affordable, and do that across the nation. And so that way we just keep straight flat fees across all 50 states, and it works out well.
No, I appreciate that so much. But you did just say something that triggered another question. So
yes,
you talked about how people who have their properties, they either have a mortgage or they own it outright. Another question we get is, can I have a property that I have a mortgage on, put into a revocable trust? And does that answer stay the same with irrevocable trusts?
I'm so glad you asked that, because the answer is it is different in these scenarios. So with a revocable trust, so if you have a revocable trust and you transfer the title of your property into the trust, there is no issue with your mortgage company.
Is it going to trigger a due on sale?
Yeah, it's not going to trigger your due on sale clause. We get that. And that's a fair question, because people, especially on the internet, there's a lot of good information and bad information. There's a lot of people that are like, oh, if you put your property over into any type of a trust, it triggers the due on sale clause or due on sale, and then they're going to call your mortgage note due. Well, with a revocable trust, they can't do that. There's some codes and statutes. We actually went over that one time, and there was a client that was, they wanted to know those specific codes and statutes. And so we sent it to them and said, this is right where it's at, where it indicates that there's no due on sale clause. Now, if it's an irrevocable trust, that's a different story. Now, remember, when you set up an irrevocable trust, you can't be the trustee. So the person that now goes on the title of the property is no longer you and your spouse. It's that trustee that you've either named or you had to hire them to do that. They now show up on the title of the property. So now all of a sudden, the title and the loan, they no longer match. Because again, you and your wife would be on the loan, but now the title no longer has your name on it. It's now in the title of this trust, and you've got another trustee that is on there. And so a lot of lenders go, nope, now we could, if they wanted to, call the note due. Now that also, they certainly have the right to do that, but are they just like searching their books and looking for that? Probably not, and then again, when a title gets transferred over as well, so like when a deed gets recorded and it moves the title over into a trust, whether it's revocable or irrevocable, a lot of times that the lender's not getting notified of that. So it would have to be them looking for one reason or another. Like maybe you missed your mortgage payment. They're like, oh no, we're gonna have to foreclose on these people, and they're now this, and they pull the title of the property and they go, wait a second. This title is no longer in your name. It's over into an irrevocable trust. We never authorized you to do that. Then that's where things could potentially go a little sideways.
So in general, if you do have a mortgage on a property and you're trying to go into an irrevocable trust, do you need to have that mortgage cleared? I mean,
Yes, typically yes. Now there are some people that will run the risk, and they'll be like, well, my lender's not going to get notified, and I'm just going to keep making the mortgage payment business as usual, and they run the risk of doing that. And so there are people that choose to to do it that way, but obviously not recommended, right? Right, with doing that. But that's the risk that you run with those irrevocable trusts. And like I said, and that's another reason why you'd want to make sure that you're sitting down with a local estate planning attorney that has at least 10 years of experience in that field of irrevocable trust, because they're going to walk you through all of those things. And that's one of the questions they're going to ask you is, do you have a mortgage on your property, and what does that look like? And what's the likelihood of if the note did get called due, what would that look like for you guys? And would you be in a position to refinance if you needed to? So there's some things that they can kind of walk them through to see if that makes sense or not.
Is there anything else that we have forgotten to cover on revocable versus irrevocable?
The only thing that just came to my mind that we didn't really talk about, because I get this question sometimes, and people go, do you guys do ILITs? So that's an irrevocable life insurance trust. So ILIT is an acronym for irrevocable life insurance trust. And that is another type of an irrevocable trust. And because it's irrevocable, we unfortunately don't do those. But those are utilized for estate planning, like tax planning, trying to get assets out of your estate. Because currently right now, like I said, the federal estate tax exemption is just under $14 million. And if somebody had a life insurance policy that pushed them over that $14 million threshold, those federal estate taxes are steep. I mean, you get 37% taxes on anything that's over that $14 million. So what a lot of people will do is they'll set up these ILITs, and they will then transfer the ownership of that. And by doing so, it's no longer part of their taxable estate when they pass away. So they're able to have life insurance, but then be able to pass that to their beneficiaries, but it doesn't count as part of their taxable estate, which is a great strategy. But again, those are kind of those high net worth earners, that it makes sense for them to do those types of things, because most people are not going to be setting up ILITs because they're nowhere near the $14 million threshold. Excuse me on that.
Yeah. Well, this is fantastic. I think this is so valuable for people. Again, as you mentioned, the internet has so many things out there of here's what you should do, or never do this, or always do this, and then you should be throwing your stuff into an irrevocable trust. And there are all these trust structures around you don't own anything, right? So make a trust, and then your businesses, and then your bank accounts, and all of this stuff. But to your point here of how much control do you want over your life, your assets, and what's going on there? And so I think this is fantastic.
I think you hit the nail right on the head when you said that. We hear that all the time. How do they say? I'm trying to think of how they say it. They're like, I was on the internet and I saw that own nothing, control everything. That's what it is. I hear that all the time. Own nothing, control everything. And they want to set up all these really, really complex trusts that do all these, alleged amazing things. And then a lot of times we'll say, okay, well, how much money do you have? And they're like, well, I've got I've got a little bit in savings, and I've got mortgage on my home, and that's not that that's a bad thing, but they're nowhere near that threshold of needing all these complex tools to do X, Y, and Z. And so that, again, for a lot of times when you hear and read a lot of those things, that's for a very small portion of the population that really should be doing those types of things.
Yeah, the costs to set all of that up and to manage that going into the future have to be to where what you're saving on it is above that. Right?
Correct. Yeah. Yep, that's exactly right.
Well, I think that you've handled all of the questions I have, but I think the most difficult question is the secret keyword for everybody if they've made it this far.
I knew you were going to do that to me on there. I knew you were going to summertime.
Summertime. Yes.
I was thinking about that. I said, hey, we're coming into summertime, so summertime or suntan.
There you go.
Summertime or suntan, either of those will do.
Well, you mentioned again, you don't help with irrevocable trusts. Go find a local estate planning attorney with that. But for those who do want a revocable trust, which again is probably 90 to 95% of the people on this planet in the United States.
Yeah.
I've also gotten that. I've had people in the UK and stuff reach out.
Yeah,
But in the United States, what can they do to get your help, and what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things. Obviously, you can go right to the website. You can go to easylegalplanning.com. It has some of our videos that we've done that are on there. We've got a questionnaire that they can start to fill out. And really, at the end of the questionnaire, if somebody's ready to go, they can fill out the questionnaire and then they can submit payment right at the end, and we'll start to get things moving forward immediately with doing that. You can also email us as well. That's probably another easy way to get a hold of us. Probably one of the easiest things to do is email us at service@easylegalplanning.com. That's a great and a simple way to get a hold of us. And then if you have any questions, then we can get back to you on that one. But truthfully, we'd love to be able to help you.
What is the timing between if I want to have this estate plan done, I submitted the questionnaire, I've talked to you maybe, and then submitted payment to when I got it in my house and I'm ready to sign?
It normally takes us about 7 to 10 days to get the docs drafted. So, which is pretty quick.
Yeah.
Sometimes I say that and people are like, oh, that's a lot of times, a lot of firms, it could be a month to 2 months, to do. Not all the time, but we're pretty quick. 7 to 10 days is pretty quick. And then what we do is once the docs are done being drafted, we email a really short summary so you can just double check everything before we actually print the document. So that way, if there was somebody's name was spelled incorrectly or a birth date was off, we can catch that ahead of time. Now, even if we did print and there was an error, we can certainly fix that. But we like to try to handle those things on the front end. So we send an email, and then typically we try to encourage people to get back to us as that same day or within 24 hours. Because the sooner you get back to us, then all of a sudden we can get everything ready to print. And then it usually takes about a day or two to get everything ready to print. And then depending on where you live, that's typically 3 to 5 days. So for most people, it's about 2 weeks from the time they submit payment until the time they have the actual binder in their hands. It's about 2 weeks. We see this quite often. There a lot of companies that do this online. They make you download your own and then you print it. And a lot of people don't know this, but estate planning documents are pretty lengthy. I mean, ours are between 100 and 130 pages, sometimes even a little bit more than that. And so if you're trying to print that yourself, you better have a good printer. But the other issue is once it is printed, then you have to get everything signed and notarized. And a lot of people are trying to fumble through, like, where do I sign? And it makes it a little bit difficult. So that's why we always do the hard copy. So we actually have a hard copy. We have sign here sticky tabs. Makes it super easy for you to do that. And then another question that people ask is they go, where do I store it? Like once we have all the documents signed and notarized, like, where do we put it? Do we send it back to you guys? I'm like, no, you keep it. And if you have like a safe or fireproof box, you're gonna want to put it into that. That's the best place to do that. Or another thing that we always tell people to do is if you have a scanner, scan all the signed and notarized documents and then save it, and you can share that with your successor trustees or the people that you've named to carry out your wishes, which is a very, very helpful if there's an emergency. So that way they're not looking for the hard copy. They can use either or. If you've only got a scanner that can do one page at a time, probably ought to go into like a Office Max or Staples or Kinko's or something like that, where it might cost you $15 or so, but have them run it through one of those big scanners, and then they'll save it on like a jump drive or a PDF, and then you can just email that to yourself and to your successors as well. But that's really probably one of the very, very best things to do. So that way, if there ever was a fire and the original did get burned, you've got a signed and notarized digital copy. People would be like, can you send me, a digital copy? I'll be like, oh, absolutely. But it's unsigned. So if the original, got lost or burned or whatever, they're not going to be able to utilize that unsigned version. So it's really kind of worthless unless you've got the signed and notarized documents.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, you're fantastic, and I'm so glad that you are part of the Retirement Nerds. Just being
I am as well.
It's just fantastic. So
thank you so much, and yeah, we'll love it as well. Okay, so literally right as we got going there, I was laughing because I was like, Oh my gosh, I'm trying not to like force myself on a cough there. Oh my gosh.